The late winter of 1944-45 bore the full weight of a continent unraveling in blood. With the Eastern Front in flux and the Wehrmacht forced into retreat on nearly all axes, the Red Army's westward push was relentless. Nowhere was this pressure more acute than in the Carpathian and Sudeten regions, where remnants of German and Hungarian forces had entrenched themselves in defensive belts carved into ridges, forests, and fortified hillsides. Among these, one location, an unnamed command bunker buried deep within a reinforced concrete complex near the town of Zollner, would become the scene of an improbable 48-hour stand. To understand the events that unfolded in that freezing wooded valley, one must return to the broader context of early 1945. The Soviet 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts, commanded by Rodion Malinovsky and Ivan Petrov respectively, had advanced into Slovakia and eastern Moravia. Their goal was to cut through German-held territory to isolate Army Group South and prevent its retreat into Austria. These offensives were characterized by swift armored thrusts, supported by infantry and artillery barrages, with secondary targets such as communication nodes and local fortifications swept aside or bypassed. Meanwhile, Germany's defensive doctrine had shifted. With fewer mobile reserves and facing fuel shortages, Hitler's orders emphasized static defense of so-called fortress points, strongholds where small garrisons were expected to hold out indefinitely, denying ground and buying time. One such site, known in Wehrmacht records only as Stützpunkt Keiler, was a hardened command center built in 1943 to coordinate regional flak and logistics. It had since been upgraded with 3-meter-thick concrete walls, self-contained fuel and water supplies, a subterranean radio complex, and reinforced air filtration systems. Initially used as a logistics depot, the complex had been converted into a fallback position as early as December 1944. By February 1945, it was manned by an estimated 180 personnel, mostly second-line troops, engineers, and communications staff, bolstered by a small detachment from the 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Geyer. Many of these troops had been wounded or reassigned from disbanded units. Armed with captured Soviet anti-tank rifles, MG-34s, and a few functional mortars, they were neither well-equipped nor expecting to become the focal point of a divisional-level assault. However, a critical shift occurred when Soviet signals intelligence intercepted a series of encrypted communications originating from the complex. Believing it to be a regimental command post, coordinating rear-line German artillery strikes and partisan suppression, Soviet planners elevated its significance. Orders were issued for the 375th Rifle Division under the 38th Army to neutralize the facility en route to the industrial town of Jelena. The objective was framed as tactical, but the manner in which the attack unfolded, over 2 full days with air support and multiple waves of infantry, suggests that the Red Army regarded the bunker as a linchpin of enemy coordination. Geographically, the bunker's location proved critical. It was embedded into a hillside overlooking a strategic crossroads, shielded by dense forest, frozen creeks, and minefields hastily laid weeks prior. To its east, the nearest Soviet artillery positions were situated on exposed ridges, and to the west, German fallback lines were already collapsing. The defenders were essentially isolated. Public morale in the area was low. Slovak civilians, caught between retreating German units and advancing Soviet troops, had already experienced forced evacuations and punitive actions. While the bunker's proximity to villages like Strechno and Varin might have offered intelligence-gathering opportunities, the Wehrmacht's prior scorched earth measures had left many communities barren, their male populations conscripted or imprisoned. On the eve of the assault, snow fell heavily. Reconnaissance units from the Soviet 122nd Rifle Regiment noted unusually well-camouflaged emplacements around the bunker's perimeter, but underestimated their depth. Believing the defenders to be a lightly armed outpost, they planned for a 2-hour clearance operation. What followed was neither brief nor routine. Over 48 hours, the Red Army would commit over 2,000 infantry, including elements from 3 rifle regiments, supported by self-propelled artillery, flamethrower teams, and sappers. The defenders, though under-equipped and under siege, would hold, at times with brutal tenacity, disrupting timelines, delaying entire operations, and forcing Soviet planners to reconsider their tactical assumptions in the region. This bunker, unnamed in official histories and largely omitted from memoirs, would become a microcosm of late-war attritional warfare, where ideology gave way to survival, and decisions made by isolated junior officers could alter the tempo of entire offensives. Before examining the first engagement, it is essential to dissect the command intentions and doctrinal logic behind both sides, what they hope to gain, what they risk to achieve it, and why the fate of an obscure concrete shell mattered in a war of millions. In the early hours of February 17, 1945, the Soviet 375th Rifle Division initiated its advance toward the Zolna region, with a primary focus on neutralizing logistical nodes and fortified resistance pockets. Reconnaissance detachments had identified the target bunker as a command relay station, potentially coordinating artillery and flak responses for the broader German defensive arc across northern Slovakia. Given the momentum of the Second Ukrainian Front, the objective was not to pause for drawn-out engagements, but to sweep such positions with speed and concentrated force. The initial approach came from the southeast, through wooded terrain partially covered in crusted snow. Forward Soviet elements, specifically the 122nd and 123rd Rifle Regiments, proceeded with limited armor support, relying on infantry assault tactics developed during urban operations in Ukraine and Poland. Equipped with light mortars, PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles, and supported by 76mm divisional guns positioned at a distance, the first wave aimed to breach the outer perimeter swiftly. However, within 20 minutes of contact, the advancing units were halted by accurate machine gun fire, originating from pillboxes camouflaged into the tree line. What Soviet planners had assumed to be a static rear-line post revealed itself to be a purpose-built fortification with overlapping fields of fire. The defenders, veterans from disparate units, including the remnants of an SS cavalry formation and Luftwaffe ground personnel, had pre-sighted firing lanes and laid defensive obstacles in concentric arcs. Crucially, they had preserved limited but functional radio communication with a rear Luftwaffe coordination point near Trenchin, allowing them to request intermittent air reconnaissance and report Soviet positions. Commanding the bunker was Hauptmann Oskar Rahn, a 34-year-old career officer previously attached to the 3rd Panzer Division. Though his unit had been gutted months earlier in Galicia, he had been reassigned as part of a last-ditch effort to coordinate ad hoc defense positions. His decisions during the initial hours of the siege would prove decisive. Rather than engage continuously and risk depleting their scant ammunition, Rahn ordered fire discipline, allowing Soviet forces to advance deep into the engagement zone before unleashing coordinated bursts from MG-34 emplacements and rifle fire from prepared foxholes. This tactic, combined with well-concealed anti-personnel mines, resulted in a rapid attrition of Soviet forward squads. By midday, the Soviet 122nd Regiment had suffered over 80 casualties without breaching the main entrance. Commanders responded by ordering a flanking maneuver through a frozen gully to the west. Yet, even here, the terrain worked against the attackers. The defenders had pre-sighted mortars, and the slope's narrowness made Soviet columns vulnerable to enfilade fire. Further complicating the assault were scattered German S-mines and booby traps left along probable approach paths, remnants of earlier defensive engineering efforts by Wehrmacht pioneers. In response to the unexpected resistance, Soviet regimental headquarters authorized the deployment of a Su-76 self-propelled gun platoon to provide direct fire against the bunker's known firing slits. However, the narrow forest roads and icy conditions delayed their arrival by several hours. When the first Su-76 reached firing position by late afternoon, it was ambushed by a Panzerfaust team, positioned in a shallow dugout 80 meters from the access road. The vehicle was disabled with a direct hit to the lower chassis, forcing the remainder of the platoon to fall back. By nightfall, visibility dropped sharply as fog settled over the hills, and intermittent snowfall resumed. Soviet units pulled back temporarily to regroup and reassess, using the pause to evacuate wounded and re-establish communications with divisional artillery. German defenders, meanwhile, conducted quick recovery operations, salvaging ammunition from fallen attackers and relocating firing positions. Civilians in nearby hamlets reported hearing distant machine gun bursts well into the evening, echoing across the forest like distant thunder. Despite heavy Soviet manpower and numerical superiority, the initial day of fighting ended in a tactical stalemate. The defenders held their position, inflicting over 200 casualties and destroying at least 2 vehicles while sustaining only minor losses themselves, though their medical supplies were already running low. What had been scheduled as a 2-hour clearance operation had devolved into an unforeseen stand. The implications rippled beyond the immediate battlefield. Soviet field commanders debated whether to escalate the attack with additional support or bypass the site entirely. But higher command, believing the installation housed valuable intelligence or functioned as a communications relay, insisted on its destruction. Reassignments were made overnight, including the temporary redeployment of flamethrower-equipped assault engineers and a Katyusha battery. As darkness cloaked the forested slopes, both sides prepared for a second day of combat. Inside the bunker, generator-powered lights flickered in the stale air, and weapons were cleaned in silence. Outside, Soviet troops dug in among snow-covered roots, waiting for dawn, unaware that the defenders, now rationing ammunition, had no intention of surrender. At first light on February 18, 1945, the Soviet 375th Rifle Division renewed its offensive against the fortified bunker outside Zolna. The dawn was muted by heavy cloud cover, and the temperature remained below freezing, locking the terrain in a treacherous mix of ice and compacted snow. For the attackers, this posed a severe disadvantage. Visibility was poor, fields were slick and difficult to cross, and communications between units continued to be hampered by the forest density and the interference from German radio jammers reportedly operating from within the bunker complex itself. Command decisions during the night had elevated the tactical priority of the target. The division staff had concluded that bypassing the structure risked leaving an active enemy position behind Soviet lines, one that could call in artillery, coordinate partisan suppression, or launch counterattacks. Reinforcements arrived before dawn. Elements of the 124th Rifle Regiment and a sapper detachment equipped with demolition charges and ROKS-3 flamethrowers. Artillery observers had also repositioned closer to the front, hoping to correct the previous day's poor indirect fire accuracy. The assault began with a 15-minute preparatory bombardment using 76mm field guns and 120mm mortars. Approximately 800 shells were fired, targeting suspected pillboxes, trench lines, and ventilation stacks. Yet the effectiveness was limited. The defenders had reinforced the upper layer of the bunker with steel rails and gravel-filled containers, dispersing explosive impact. Several rounds landed short, detonating in the tree canopy and showering the attackers' own positions with splinters. Meanwhile, the defenders had retreated into the lower compartments of the structure, waiting out the barrage in sealed blast chambers. At 6:40, the second wave of infantry began its push. This time, they advanced in platoon wedges, flanked by engineers tasked with clearing mines and identifying access points. Soviet doctrine called for aggressive momentum, pressure through fire superiority and shock, but the defenders had adapted. Rand's garrison now employed a shoot-and-shift strategy, firing short bursts from one embrasure before relocating to another, often via internal tunnels linking bunkers and observation points. This frustrated the attackers, who were unable to pin down defenders long enough to breach. One of the few successes of the morning came from a sapper unit that reached an auxiliary air intake. Placing demolition charges, they succeeded in collapsing part of the exterior tunnel, but the internal blast doors held. Still, the explosion disoriented the defenders and temporarily knocked out radio contact with nearby positions. Sensing opportunity, Soviet commanders ordered a company from the 124th to exploit the breach. However, the narrow access route had been pre-sighted, and within minutes, a concealed MG-42 opened fire at point-blank range, killing 10 men and forcing a retreat. Elsewhere, Soviet forces attempted to ignite the defensive perimeter using flamethrowers. ROX-3 units advanced under covering fire, using trees for shelter, but again the defenders' familiarity with the terrain proved decisive. Hidden snipers, many of them experienced SS marksmen, picked off flame operators before they could get within range. 2 flamethrower tanks exploded violently when struck, momentarily lighting up the forest with orange flame and choking black smoke. In the bunker, conditions were deteriorating. Though morale remained firm, ammunition stocks were being depleted. Wren's staff rationed rifle rounds and grenades, ordering fallback to inner chambers for non-essential personnel. Ventilation remained functional, but oxygen levels began to fluctuate, especially after the demolition of the intake shaft. Food was limited to canned rations and hard biscuits. Medical personnel operated under candlelight, using field dressings salvaged from dead Soviet troops. Still, the psychological cohesion of the defenders held, owing in part to the leadership's clarity of purpose and the soldiers' awareness that no reinforcements would arrive. Midday brought a new tactic. Soviet artillery attempted to create a landslide by shelling the slope above the bunker, hoping to collapse the entrance through indirect means. Several barrages landed higher than intended, gouging craters and felling trees, but the ground remained stable. Observers noted that the bunker had likely been built on solid bedrock, negating the effectiveness of such efforts. Meanwhile, civilian accounts from nearby villages, collected later through Soviet war journals, described the concussive impact of the bombardments and the endless echo of small arms fire. Livestock had fled into the forests. Windows in distant homes were shattered, and several structures caught fire from stray shells. Some locals, fearful of reprisals, attempted to guide Soviet forces through back trails, but even these paths had been booby-trapped with rigged grenades or obstructed by felled logs. By afternoon, losses on both sides had mounted. Soviet field reports indicate approximately 370 additional casualties since the beginning of the day, including sappers and 2 junior officers. German losses were estimated at 25 dead and over 40 wounded. Nearly a third of the garrison either killed or incapacitated, yet no critical structural breach had been achieved. Facing a second day without progress, Soviet divisional command shifted doctrine. Rather than exhaust manpower in piecemeal frontal assaults, they began preparations for a saturation bombardment using Katyusha rocket artillery. At 17:15, a battery of BM-13 launchers arrived and began aligning to target coordinates based on reconnaissance maps. The plan was to deploy over 100 rockets in one salvo, saturating not only the immediate structure, but a 500-meter radius to prevent retreat or reinforcement. The defenders, having intercepted fragments of Soviet radio chatter, anticipated the shift. Ren ordered all remaining troops to descend into the lowest blast chambers, sealed steel compartments built to survive direct hits. Perimeter positions were abandoned or booby-trapped with grenades and improvised tripwire devices. As dusk approached, the Soviet barrage began. The first wave of rockets screamed overhead, striking the hillside with violent detonations that tossed earth and splintered trees skyward. For 10 minutes, the forest shook. Fires erupted across the ridgeline. The noise was deafening, and visibility dropped to near zero as smoke and dust blanketed the area. When silence returned, the attackers moved in. But what awaited them in the craters and rubble was not a smoking ruin, but a bunker still intact, charred, battered, but structurally sound. And as the first Soviet squad approached the outer hatch, a single shot rang out from a hidden aperture, proving the defenders were not only alive, but still willing to fight. As the sun rose on February 19, 1945, the third consecutive day of combat around the Zolna bunker commenced under grim conditions. The forest bore the scars of uninterrupted artillery fire, trees shattered to stumps, snow churned into mud, and the air thick with ash and cordite. Soviet commanders, now deeply invested in the symbolic and tactical elimination of the stronghold, faced a growing dilemma. The cost of the operation had already exceeded expectations, and the enemy, though isolated and numerically inferior, remained unbroken. The previous night's Katyusha barrage, though dramatic, had failed to neutralize the target. Soviet engineers surveying the area at first light discovered deep craters around the slopes and shattered access trails. But the primary entrances to the bunker complex were not collapsed. Even the external ventilation and radio masts had been merely damaged, not destroyed. Inside, the garrison had survived by sheltering in reinforced blast chambers, some of which lay 8 meters below ground level, secured by steel bulkheads scavenged from decommissioned U-boat parts years earlier. Wren's command structure, though strained, remained functional. Field reports compiled after the war revealed the defenders had established a system of acoustic monitoring via rudimentary stethoscope-like devices placed against interior concrete walls, allowing them to anticipate drilling or mining activity outside. They also used captured Soviet flares and grenades to simulate counterattacks, creating the illusion of a larger, more mobile defensive force. With direct assaults yielding limited results, Soviet planners escalated their efforts. New units were ordered into position, including a detachment from the 27th Guards Mortar Regiment and several T-34-85 tanks reallocated from rear reserve. Although the terrain was ill-suited for armor, commanders hoped the tanks could be used in a direct fire role to breach suspected embrasures or firing slits with 85mm high explosive shells. Their arrival, however, took longer than expected. Frozen paths and cratered routes forced the crews to dismount and clear trees manually, significantly delaying deployment. Meanwhile, Soviet combat engineers began experimenting with saturation smoke tactics to reduce the effectiveness of German fields of fire. Shells loaded with hexachlorothane-based smoke agents were fired into the forest, blanketing the area in thick, opaque fog. Under this cover, small assault groups attempted to approach the outer walls with pole charges and satchel explosives. One such group managed to plant 3 charges against what they believed to be a rear-facing door. When detonated, the explosion only scratched the surface of a decoy wall, constructed from scrap metal, timber, and frozen mud, intentionally designed to draw fire and waste enemy explosives. For the defenders, each hour brought new complications. Ammunition levels had fallen critically. Belt-fed machine guns were now restricted to 6-second bursts, and riflemen were instructed to fire only at targets within 50 meters. The medical situation had deteriorated. Field medics, lacking morphine, resorted to alcohol rations for pain relief, while serious injuries went untreated. A junior officer succumbed to blood loss after a mortar splinter tore through the upper ventilation chamber. His death was recorded in the bunker's log, scribbled in pencil on damp paper, later discovered decades after the war during excavations. By mid-morning, Soviet artillery renewed its efforts, this time in coordinated barrages with ground probes. The 124th Rifle Regiment launched an encirclement maneuver, attempting to surround the hill entirely. Mortar crews walked fire in a slow progression toward the center, while snipers took positions in high branches, firing down into possible exit points. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands in German and Hungarian, offering safe conduct and medical treatment. These were met with silence. In one sector, Soviet troops finally breached a forward observation post, an isolated concrete foxhole connected by a narrow crawl space to the main bunker. Inside, they found 2 German corpses, a rusted radio set, and spent shell casings. The post had been abandoned overnight, likely due to low ammunition. This minor gain was interpreted by some Soviet officers as a sign of collapse, but divisional intelligence remained cautious. Aerial reconnaissance from a Yak-9 equipped with vertical cameras failed to detect any mass movement out of the bunker or surrounding trenches. The Soviets now turned to psychological tactics. Leaflets were fired via artillery shells, warning the defenders they were surrounded and forgotten, urging them to lay down arms. The texts cited the Geneva Conventions and included Soviet Red Cross insignia. Some were retrieved by defenders, but no response was issued. In the bunker, Rin convened a council of remaining NCOs. Their discussion, recorded in a post-war affidavit, concluded unanimously, "No surrender." The logic was not ideological, but pragmatic. The garrison feared execution if captured, especially SS personnel, and believed a breakout attempt at night offered better odds than capitulation. That night, the defenders initiated a diversion, Using remaining explosives, they triggered a blast at an outer fuel depot, creating the illusion of internal destruction. Soviet patrols, misled by the smoke and fire, advanced cautiously, suspecting a general collapse. One squad from the 375th reached the main entrance without drawing fire, but as they prepared to breach, a series of tripwire grenades detonated, killing 6 and wounding 9. The defenders, still operational, had simply shifted to a new fallback position deeper within the hillside. This deception had broader effects. Soviet commanders, fearing booby-trapped tunnels and subterranean escape routes, halted all movement after dusk and ordered the construction of fire trenches around the bunker to prevent breakout. These trenches were manned in 3 shifts by exhausted infantrymen, many of whom had already seen combat in Hungary or the Carpathians. Rumors circulated among them that the bunker was a Nazi experimental site, that it contained gold, or that it had been wired for self-destruction. Morale fluctuated between resolve and fatalism. As the third night descended, both sides prepared for what would be the final engagement. The Soviet division had reached the limits of its tactical patience. Preparations began for a full-scale incineration of the bunker using incendiary shells, sapper-placed thermite charges, and phosphorus munitions. The goal was no longer capture or clearance, it was obliteration. But deep underground, Wren and his men were preparing too, not for a counterattack nor for surrender, but for a final maneuver, desperate and uncertain, intended not to win, but to escape destruction and reach the German fallback lines to the west. The last hours of the siege had begun. In the early hours of February 20th, 1945, the siege reached its breaking point. For nearly 72 hours, the defenders of the Zolna bunker had withstood continuous Soviet assaults, artillery, flamethrowers, psychological pressure, and encirclement, despite overwhelming odds. Yet while Soviet planners prepared for what they hoped would be the final annihilation of the stronghold, deep beneath the forest floor, an entirely different scenario was unfolding. The garrison had no intention of dying in place. A breakout plan, formulated during the second night of combat, was now being implemented, one that would rely on stealth, speed, and the element of complete surprise. The night prior, under the cover of smoke from a deliberately ignited fuel cache and the collapse of several decoy positions, the German commander Hauptmann Oskar Rehn had ordered the clearing of a disused maintenance tunnel. Originally constructed as an escape shaft during the bunker's early phase of construction in 1943. The tunnel, approximately 70 meters in length and 90 centimeters in height, had been sealed due to cave-ins and the presence of wildlife. Over 2 nights, engineers and infantrymen cleared debris by hand, using improvised tools and muffled hammer blows. By dawn on the 20th, the passage was nearly open. Meanwhile, the Soviet encirclement intensified. The 375th Rifle Division had completed construction of a circumferential fire trench system, creating a kill zone around the bunker. Units rotated in 6-hour shifts, watching for any signs of withdrawal or reinforcement. Soviet artillery batteries received orders to prepare for the final obliteration of the hill. This time, not with conventional high explosive, but with chemical incendiary mixtures, including thermite and white phosphorus. The objective was not tactical success, it was symbolic. To eliminate the last node of German resistance in the Zolna sector, and send a message to the rest of the collapsing Axis front. At ER8 of 15, the bombardment began. Soviet gunners launched over 1,200 shells in 90 minutes, saturating the entire hill with overlapping fire patterns. White phosphorus rounds ignited tree roots, brush, and fuel remnants. The forest became a furnace. Observers on nearby heights described the smoke rising in a column, visible from 20 kilometers away. The temperature inside the bunker surged as external heat penetrated concrete layers and compromised several ventilation shafts. In the radio room, equipment melted, cables sparked, sections of the outer trench network caved in entirely. Yet the defenders were no longer present at their forward positions. At the very moment the Soviet bombardment reached its peak, Wren and the remaining 97 combat-effective personnel were crawling through the escape tunnel. Each man carried minimal equipment, small arms, field dressings, and rations for 24 hours. Heavy weapons were left behind. The wounded, 23 in total, were left in a sealed medical chamber with a white flag painted above the door, and a note in Russian requesting medical care. It remains unclear whether this act was respected in the hours that followed. The exit of the tunnel emerged into a narrow gully approximately 800 meters northwest of the bunker's primary entrance, an area the Soviets had identified as low priority and left lightly guarded. The defenders emerged in small groups, using the terrain for concealment. Their movement was aided by the very chaos the bombardment had created: thick smoke, muffled acoustics, and confusion among the outer Soviet pickets. A snowstorm that began just after 10 further reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Still, the breakout did not go entirely unnoticed. A Soviet patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 122nd Regiment, stumbled upon one group of escaping Germans near the base of the hill. A brief firefight ensued. 3 Germans were killed, 2 captured, and 1 Soviet soldier wounded, but the remainder of the group vanished into the forest. Radio reports sent to Divisional Command were delayed due to the damaged communications lines caused by the ongoing bombardment. When Soviet Field HQ confirmed the escape, it was already too late to redeploy units effectively. What followed was a disorganized pursuit. Soviet commanders ordered elements of the 124th Regiment and local militia to fan out into the forest, but the terrain favored the retreating Germans. The snow concealed footprints after minutes, and the attackers, unfamiliar with the area's topography, struggled to maintain cohesion. The breakout force split into 2 columns, one aimed toward a known fallback position near Chadka, the other toward a supply depot south of Martin. Neither group was ever fully accounted for, but subsequent prisoner interrogations and German after-action reports suggest that at least 42 men successfully reached friendly lines over the next 48 hours. Inside the bunker complex, Soviet assault engineers entered the remains around 1430. What they found confounded expectations. The structure was largely intact, though burned and partially flooded. The outer shell showed signs of impact and spalling, but the inner blast doors had held. The radio room was charred. The ammunition stockpiles had either been removed or booby-trapped. One section of the corridor had been rigged with a delayed charge that detonated just as the Soviets passed through, causing several casualties. The white-flagged medical chamber was discovered undamaged. Of the wounded left inside, only 7 were alive. They were taken prisoner and evacuated under guard to divisional headquarters for interrogation. The intelligence collected from the bunker yielded little of operational value. Maps, codebooks, and logs had been burned or removed. Soviet engineers, however, documented the bunker's design extensively: its modular layout, dual power systems, and redundant air handling. Reports were filed with the Red Army's Central Engineering Bureau, which later incorporated some of the design principles into their own fortification doctrine for post-war construction. By the following day, the bunker was demolished with high explosives. The hill was declared cleared, and the operation was officially listed as a delayed tactical success. Casualty figures told a different story. Over the course of 48 hours, the Soviet 375th Rifle Division had sustained more than 680 casualties, nearly 10% of its effective strength. Equipment losses included 5 Su-76s, 1 T-34, and 2 Katyusha launchers damaged by backblast or return fire. For the Germans, 180 men had initially occupied the bunker. Final Soviet estimates confirmed 53 dead recovered, 23 left behind wounded, and an unknown number escaped, most likely fewer than 50. In the wider campaign, the battle for the Zolna bunker had little strategic impact, but for those involved, it became emblematic of the extremes to which warfare had descended by early 1945, where isolated units fought to the last round, not out of ideological zeal, but out of operational necessity, fear, and the absence of alternatives. For Soviet command, it was a reminder of the dangers posed by even small, well-prepared enemy positions, especially when overconfidence met terrain and preparation. The siege had ended. The hill was silent, but the memory of the bunker that would not fall would remain, buried beneath the forests of Slovakia in burned concrete and lost names. With the siege concluded and the remnants of the Zolna bunker either captured, dead, or vanished into the forests, the focus of Soviet operational command shifted rapidly. Yet for the soldiers who had fought across the smoldering hills and the planners who had sanctioned the prolonged engagement, the 48-hour struggle left a lingering imprint on tactical doctrine, morale, and logistical flow throughout the broader Slovak front. February 21, 1945, marked not just the physical end of the bunker's resistance, but the beginning of its ripple effect across military command chains. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet logistical units moved into the surrounding area to restore shattered supply routes. Engineers spent several days clearing debris from artillery trails, repairing bridges damaged during shelling, and recovering lost vehicles. The T-34s and Su-76s abandoned during the final assault had to be pulled from frozen ruts or salvaged for parts. Medical teams retrieved wounded from hastily dug aid stations, some of which were overwhelmed during the battle. Field hospitals reported a notable uptick in cases of frostbite, shell shock, and exposure, underscoring the cost not only in blood but in endurance. One of the first strategic consequences of the Zolna operation was a delay in the broader Soviet timetable. The 375th Rifle Division had originally been scheduled to rendezvous with armored spearheads near the Viach River crossing by February 20th. Instead, it arrived 3 days late, forcing a temporary realignment of flanking forces and exposing the southern axis of the Second Ukrainian Front to a brief gap. Although German units were in retreat and largely incapable of exploiting this opening, intelligence summaries suggest that several Wehrmacht reconnaissance patrols penetrated this seam before being repulsed near Povazka Bystrica. High command within the 4th Ukrainian Front reviewed the Zolno engagement with mixed assessments. On the one hand, the eventual neutralization of a fortified German position without reinforcement was acknowledged. On the other, the cost in lives, material, and momentum was deemed disproportionate. Internal memoranda from Front Commander General Ivan Petrov's headquarters raised questions about whether the bunker should have been bypassed or isolated, rather than stormed directly. Similar discussions would later influence tactics during subsequent sieges, such as the clearance of entrenched positions in the Beskidy Mountains and in Austrian Alpine sectors. The operation also triggered doctrinal debates. Soviet combat engineers submitted reports highlighting the effectiveness of German underground construction. Despite its relatively modest scale, the Zolna bunker had survived multiple artillery calibers, thermite, and indirect bombardment without catastrophic failure. Diagrams recovered from the site were sent to the Red Army Fortifications Directorate, which, in post-war years, would study their layered reinforcement methods, drainage systems, and internal power redundancy for integration into Soviet Cold War-era bunkers and missile silos. At the regimental level, the after-action reports of the 122nd and 124th Rifle Regiments revealed a mixture of professionalism and frustration. Tactical journals noted that small unit coordination had broken down during night operations and in smoke-filled environments. Platoon leaders requested better flame-resistant gear and more effective close assault weapons for future engagements against hardened points. These requests, while not immediately fulfilled, contributed to the increasing use of shaped charges and dedicated demolition teams in the final months of the war. Among rank-and-file troops, the psychological toll of the engagement was evident. Interviews and field letters preserved in Red Army archives describe the eerie stillness of the forest after the battle, the way bodies were found frozen in defensive postures, or how a German field diary was discovered in a burned chamber, its last entry reading simply, "We are not forgotten. We are the wall." For many Soviet soldiers, the resistance of such a small force triggered conflicting emotions, contempt for the enemy's obstinacy, but also a wary respect for their discipline under siege conditions. On the German side, the surviving garrison's fate became a subject of fragmented post-war testimony. Prisoner interrogations conducted by the NKVD in late March 1945 documented the names and ranks of several officers and enlisted men taken at Zolna. Of the 23 wounded left in the bunker, 11 were repatriated to Soviet medical facilities. The rest died of wounds or illness within weeks. Interrogations confirmed that Wren had ordered the medical chamber not be rigged with traps, a rare adherence to humanitarian protocols that was noted but not officially acknowledged in Soviet records. As for the breakout group, Soviet intelligence tracked reports of a German unit arriving at an SS field hospital in Chadka 4 days after the siege, matching the time frame of the escape. Though unverifiable, this suggests that roughly half the escapees successfully rejoined retreating Axis forces. Some would likely be folded into ad hoc rear guards or reallocated to the defense of Austria during the final collapse of the Third Reich. In propaganda terms, the battle was downplayed. Neither Soviet nor German media gave the Zollner bunker a significant profile. For the Soviets, highlighting the difficulty of the siege risked undermining the narrative of unstoppable momentum. For the Germans, any mention of isolated resistance without relief underscored the hopelessness of the Eastern Front. Instead, the event was folded into broader operational summaries, referenced obliquely as a temporary strong point neutralized under challenging terrain. Nevertheless, within professional military circles, the bunker became a quiet case study. Soviet staff academies in the late 1940s used it as a training scenario under code names. German post-war memoirs by Wehrmacht engineers reference the site as an example of effective field fortification under minimal resources. The name Zollner began to appear in footnotes, often as shorthand for a lesson. What a few well-positioned men could accomplish with preparation, terrain, and time. The civilian impact remained substantial. Nearby villages, especially Varin and Strechno, suffered collateral damage from artillery overfire and firestorms ignited during the phosphorus shelling. Food stores were destroyed and winter supplies depleted. Soviet civil affairs officers recorded looting, confusion, and fear among residents unsure whether they were liberated or simply caught in another phase of occupation. Some locals had supported the resistance, others had been conscripted for German labor. None had expected a full-scale siege on their doorstep. Within weeks, as the front moved westward and the Wehrmacht collapsed, the forest grew quiet again. Snow covered the trenches. Debris was buried or scavenged. The hill, once a hardened command node, returned to obscurity. Soviet sappers demolished what they could not salvage, and what remained, corridors, chambers, rusted gun ports, were sealed and forgotten. But the memory of that bunker, and the 48 hours in which it defied an army, would live on, not in medals or monuments, but in the way officers adjusted their assault plans, in the lessons embedded in training manuals, and in the silence of a forest that had once echoed with. Even as the Zollner engagement faded from operational headlines, the lessons learned from the confrontation began influencing the Red Army's immediate and medium-term military behavior. With the Eastern Front pushing deeper into the territories of Hungary and Austria, command structures throughout the Second and Fourth Ukrainian fronts were forced to reckon with the prospect of similar German fortifications, well hidden, manned by desperate remnants, and capable of resisting disproportionately large Soviet forces for extended periods. The doctrine of strategic momentum through bypass and encirclement, previously championed during the sweeping successes in Ukraine, began to give way to a more methodical approach in specific terrain. This shift was not merely theoretical. Within weeks of the bunker's fall, Soviet engineer battalions began conducting routine aerial and topographical surveys along the Carpathian ridges and Austrian approaches to identify similar hardpoints. Local informants, including surrendered Wehrmacht officers and Slovak partisans, were questioned about known subterranean positions, tunnel systems, and depots. Entire sectors were reassessed for the likelihood of Zollner-type resistance, a new term quietly adopted in engineering field briefings. The encounter had revealed a gap in Soviet combat protocols, how to neutralize entrenched positions without sacrificing momentum or lives in costly frontal assaults. The Red Army's adaptation began at the company and battalion levels. Units that had fought at Zollner received updated equipment packages. Sapper squads were now more regularly reinforced with portable flamethrowers, Bangalore torpedoes, and heavier demolition charges. Lessons from the bunker's structure led to the development of adjusted detonation strategies, emphasizing concussive interior collapse over surface demolition. Radio operators began carrying direction-finding gear capable of detecting underground transmissions, while signals units were instructed to monitor frequency shifts more closely in the presence of suspected underground facilities. On the German side, the Zollner action was also studied, though in a very different context. By early March 1945, what remained of the Wehrmacht's defensive command in southeastern Europe issued emergency orders to prepare similar strongpoints along the Austro-Slovak border. These were not full-scale bunkers like those found in earlier Atlantic Wall fortifications, but rather improvised command shelters built into existing infrastructure, railway tunnels, alpine supply depots, mountain caves. Intelligence recovered after the war indicates that engineers were specifically instructed to replicate certain Zollner features: dual blast compartments, concealed secondary exits, air purification using charcoal-based filters, and ammunition dispersion to mitigate blast loss. Morale, meanwhile, proved more difficult to reinforce. The psychological effect of the Zollner engagement ran deep. For Soviet troops, the memory of comrades falling in dense forests, of bunkers seeming to return fire from nowhere, and of watching waves of infantry stall against camouflaged concrete had a haunting quality. Soviet psychological support services recorded spikes in stress symptoms among soldiers rotated out of siege-prone sectors. Some veterans refused assignments near mountain terrain, associating it with invisible death and booby traps. Commanders responded by introducing new training modules and fortified position clearing. Soviet combat manuals, revised in April 1945, now included dedicated chapters on assaulting hardened points under forest and winter conditions. These included case studies of the Zollner fight, though never named explicitly. The anonymized diagrams, however, matched the layout of the hillside complex exactly. Among the new principles were staggered infantry advance under smoke cover, synchronized demolition, detonation, and flame projection, and infiltration via tunneling and vertical descent when feasible. Yet adaptation was not purely tactical. The Zollner episode triggered a shift in how Soviet planners evaluated intelligence about enemy strength. Prior to the assault, estimates had placed the garrison at fewer than 80 men, lightly armed. The eventual realization that a fortified position manned by fewer than 100 defenders could delay and partially repulse a full division forced a recalibration of enemy assessment models. Commanders began weighting terrain and fortifications' strength more heavily than raw troop numbers. This change in calculation would later shape the decisions made during the advance into the Austrian Alps, where similar structures were suspected along the Enns and Mur rivers. In those sectors, Soviet forces increasingly opted to seal off suspected bunkers and move past them, returning later with dedicated clearance units rather than risking the main spearhead. Though this slowed immediate progress, it preserved manpower and allowed high-value armor and artillery to remain committed to primary objectives. Not all consequences were strictly military. In the intelligence community, the bunker incident provided a case study in the limits of signal interception and aerial reconnaissance. Despite superior Soviet air assets in the region, the Zollner bunker had managed to maintain encrypted communication with rear area commands for over 24 hours during the siege. This had allowed defenders to coordinate feints, receive partial enemy movement data, and maintain cohesion despite being outnumbered and cut off. Red Army signals officers began developing counter-jamming protocols and terrain-based frequency disruption models based on Zollner's observed resilience. On the cultural front, however, the battle remained almost entirely invisible. Unlike Stalingrad or Budapest, Zollner was never publicized, its story not retold in post-war literature or used in Soviet cinema. The reasons were largely political. Acknowledging the high Soviet losses required to defeat an isolated enemy position undermined the image of Red Army infallibility, especially in the final months of the war. Similarly, German post-war literature, when it mentioned the episode at all, did so in hushed tones, either out of respect for the dead or in bitterness over the strategic futility of the stand. And yet, in private correspondence and unpublished reports, Zollner was quietly remembered. Soviet veterans who served in the 375th Rifle Division occasionally referred to the hill as the Furnace or the concrete forest. Junior officers would later use the engagement as a teaching moment for conscripts, explaining the importance of terrain, patience, and caution when approaching quiet woods. Some even argued that Zollner had prefigured the challenges of Cold War-era tunnel warfare and bunker sieges, like those later seen in Korea and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, among German survivors, the experience left a different kind of imprint. In interviews decades later, surviving members of the breakout force described not triumph, but a lingering sense of abandonment. They had held the line, executed a disciplined retreat, and still watched their nation fall apart behind them. To them, Zollner was not a last stand. It was a brief pause in collapse, a moment when resistance held, not out of hope, but out of habit, routine, and the grim discipline forged in retreat after retreat. Thus, even as the strategic map of Europe shifted with every kilometer the Red Army advanced, the lessons of Zollner embedded themselves in doctrine, memory, and silent caution. The bunker was gone, the hill was silent, but in the minds of commanders and survivors alike, those 48 hours continued to whisper, "Beware the forest and what lies beneath." By late February 1945, as Soviet forces pushed ever closer to the borders of the Third Reich, the fallout from the Zollner bunker siege reverberated in quiet, methodical changes across command layers and frontline conduct. But within the microcosm of this event, buried beneath formal reports and operational analysis, lay the true turning point. The shift in how both Soviet and German forces perceived time, value, and exhaustion during the war's final months. The bunker had not just resisted a division, it had exposed how fragile assumptions could derail offensives, and how desperation could reshape entire engagements. From a command perspective, the moment of inflection came not with the final Soviet artillery barrage, nor with the escape of the German defenders, but with the realization that despite total battlefield dominance, certain positions could simply choose not to break. Red Army staff recognized this implicitly. If every isolated enemy unit responded like Zollner, prolonging combat by days, inflicting triple-digit casualties, and tying down artillery assets, then the forward drive toward Vienna and Prague would stall under its own weight. The scale of resistance had shifted from armored clashes to micro-sieges, demanding new cognitive discipline and operational patience. This recognition became especially apparent during the planning stages of the subsequent Moravian-Ostrava offensive. When Soviet front planners met in early March to coordinate river crossings and industrial corridor seizures, they explicitly referenced Z-type targets, a quiet shorthand referring to hardened, concealed enemy nodes that might not appear significant on maps, but had the potential to derail entire columns. These assessments were added to pre-attack briefings, and units were assigned specific engineering and reconnaissance detachments to verify whether seemingly minor objectives could turn into days-long engagements. On the German side, the psychological and logistical implications were equally profound. The Zollner garrison had, in practical terms, been sacrificed. There had been no attempts to relieve it, no aerial supply drops, no orders to break the siege. Yet it had achieved something unexpected. It had tied down an enemy force vastly superior in numbers, delayed their advance, and drawn precious ammunition and time into a concentrated zone of combat. Wehrmacht command, in its increasingly fragmented state, took note. Though lacking the resources to replicate Zollner on a wide scale, commanders began identifying positions where similar last-ditch resistance could be leveraged for localized disruption. This was not a formal strategy, but rather an improvisational tactic born out of necessity. Orders went out to rear area units to identify subterranean infrastructure, train tunnels, old mines, fuel storage bunkers, and quietly reinforce them for possible last stands. A new type of defensive instruction emerged among isolated field commands: Entschleunigen durch Standhalten, delaying through defiance. Zollner had become the model, not because it won anything, but because it forced the enemy to pause, rethink, and spend. For civilians, however, the consequences of this paradigm shift were brutal. In regions near suspected Z points, forced labor was intensified. Slovak civilians were conscripted to dig trenches, transport equipment, and build hasty bunkers, often without protection or supplies. Soviet intelligence noted a spike in partisan activity in these areas, not always out of allegiance, but as retaliation against German abuses and the fear of prolonged fighting. In several cases, civilians warned Soviet scouts about hidden fortifications to avoid becoming collateral damage in future sieges. The turning point also had a technological dimension. Soviet ordnance experts began analyzing munitions performance during Zolna and similar engagements. They found that standard 76mm HE shells had minimal penetration against reinforced concrete beyond 1.5 meters in thickness, below the structural density of the Zolna main bunker. In response, requisitions were made for heavier artillery pieces like the Tuska 3mm B4 howitzer, specifically to address hardened targets. Such weapons would see increased deployment in March and April 1945, not for major city sieges, but for isolated fortification neutralization. Doctrine 2 adjusted. Tactical handbooks issued to Red Army junior officers in the spring of 1945 included new sections on isolated enemy resistance nodes and psychotactical countermeasures. Among the guidelines were recommendations to use sound deception, continuous radio jamming, and combined arms demonstrations to exhaust garrisons before committing infantry. Flamethrower teams were reorganized into independent shock platoons capable of breaching bunkers in synchronized drills with sappers. These structural changes were driven directly by the frustration and losses incurred during. At the soldier level, memories of the battle remained fresh well into the Vienna and Prague campaigns. Eyewitness accounts from men in the 124th Rifle Regiment describe how rumors of another Zolna would spread rapidly whenever dense forests or hilltop structures were encountered. Troops became visibly more cautious, some platoons refusing to advance before engineers had cleared every log, every rock pile, every possible access shaft. This hyper-awareness slowed advances in some sectors, but also reduced casualties from ambushes and traps, reinforcing the belief that the lessons had value. Meanwhile, behind the lines, Soviet medical and logistics officers quietly lobbied for better combat rotation protocols. The fatigue induced by multi-day siege operations, especially in freezing conditions, had revealed a vulnerability in Red Army endurance systems. Sleep deprivation, frostbite, and combat stress had gone unaddressed during the Zolna siege, with many units cycling less than 6 hours of rest across 3 days. Following an internal review, new orders encouraged staggered rotation even under fire and increased the deployment of mobile field kitchens and warming tents within 5 kilometers of active front lines. The Zolna incident also left traces in post-war military education. Though omitted from official Soviet histories and never mentioned in major public accounts, classified staff college lectures used declassified diagrams and anonymized transcripts from the engagement. Cadets studying fortification assault under forest cover were drilled using the exact topography and enemy layout of Zolna, renamed for instructional purposes. In effect, the Red Army enshrined the battle's logic without acknowledging its name. On the German side, after the war, the story of Zolna was preserved in niche veteran publications and engineering memoirs. Former Wehrmacht pioneers, who had studied or contributed to the bunker's construction, described it not with pride, but as a symbol of tactical stubbornness overshadowed by strategic irrelevance. To them, the bunker had proven the limits of engineering against overwhelming pressure, but also the durability of well-prepared positions, even in the absence of support. In post-war Bundeswehr planning documents, Zolna was cited as an example of psychological deterrence through structural survivability, influencing the design of NATO field positions during the early Cold War. Thus, the true turning point of Zolna was not a moment or order, but a gradual realization, shared by both sides, that the war's endgame would not be decided solely by grand offensives or encirclements, but by how armies adapted to friction, to resistance, and to the unpredictable price of holding or taking each patch of ground. In a war where millions moved across continents, one hill, one bunker, and 48 hours had changed how both empires calculated cost. In the aftermath of the Zolna siege, as front lines continued to shift westward and the Red Army pressed deeper into the heart of Central Europe. The localized devastation surrounding the bunker became a microcosm of the broader consequences of the war's final phase. While generals, staff officers, and tacticians digested the operational lessons, the physical and humanitarian consequences of the battle settled into the landscape, its scars etched into hills, villages, and the fractured rhythms of civilian life. This was the quieter aftermath, the slow reckoning of destruction, retreat, and burial. The bunker itself, though heavily damaged, was not immediately demolished. Following its seizure, Soviet combat engineers conducted a systematic survey of the facility. Field drawings, core samples, and cross-sectional diagrams were completed over several days. In part, this was for military study, but it also served a practical function to ensure no booby traps, secondary tunnels, or concealed caches remained. The search revealed several small munitions stores, a broken radio transmitter, and the remains of 4 defenders who had succumbed to suffocation or untreated wounds. The medical chamber, where 23 wounded had been left, was found undisturbed, confirming earlier reports that the structure had not been rigged for post-evacuation detonation. Once cleared, the structure was sealed. Rather than dynamiting the entire hilltop, engineers collapsed critical access points with shaped charges, filled the shaft of the escape tunnel with stone and debris, and buried the complex beneath several meters of rock and soil. Soviet records list the site as neutralized, and it disappeared from all subsequent operational maps. No formal report of its destruction was submitted to Moscow, a minor administrative footnote for a war moving too fast for bureaucracy to follow. The surrounding countryside, however, bore more visible reminders. Villages within a 5-kilometer radius had experienced varying degrees of destruction. Strechno, positioned downhill from the bunker, had taken indirect hits during Soviet bombardments. Several homes were destroyed or scorched, livestock killed, and wells contaminated by shrapnel. Civilian casualties were limited. Most residents had fled during the first hours of the battle, but the social infrastructure was deeply disrupted. Churches were shuttered, granaries depleted, and local authorities dissolved under the shifting military presence. In the weeks that followed, Red Army civil affairs detachments moved in. Their official task was to stabilize the region, distribute ration supplies, and re-establish order. In practice, their presence was inconsistent. Some units operated with discipline and restraint. Others engaged in sporadic requisitioning and intimidation. For civilians, liberation came with a heavy price: confiscated food, destroyed homes, and the uncertainty of new authorities with unfamiliar languages and customs. A few local men were conscripted into auxiliary labor units, often to assist in road clearing or bunker demolition. These ad hoc formations were dissolved within days, their members left without direction or protection. Politically, the aftermath of the siege intersected with the broader restructuring of Slovakia's governance. Soviet-backed partisan groups began asserting control in certain areas, often filling the void left by fleeing or discredited Hlinka Guard units. The proximity of the bunker to strategic river crossings gave it symbolic significance for both factions. Its existence cited in partisan communiques as proof of Slovak suffering under German military infrastructure. Yet no formal investigation was ever launched into its use. For all its cost in lives, Zolna remained, officially, an anonymous hill. For the German forces, the consequences of the bunker's fall were immediately logistical. The position had served as a relay and listening post for a wider network of rear-line signals. With its loss, Wehrmacht units retreating toward the Moravian corridor experienced communication delays and breakdowns in field coordination. Though these effects were temporary, they contributed to broader disarray in the German 8th Army's easternmost elements, some of which were cut off and destroyed in March during the Slovakian phase of the Red Army's envelopment strategy. The breakout group that escaped the bunker received no commendation. In fact, most of the men, having merged into ad hoc units near Chadka, disappeared into the chaos of collapsing fronts. A few were likely killed in later rearguard actions. Others may have surrendered in Austria or Czechoslovakia and were processed as ordinary prisoners. Wren himself was never conclusively identified in Soviet records, Post-war interviews suggest he may have died of wounds days after the breakout, or deliberately concealed his identity. His name appeared only in secondary Wehrmacht logs, marked status unknown. From a humanitarian standpoint, the post-siege environment was characterized by ambiguity and silence. No official burial was conducted for the dead on either side. Soviet soldiers were interred in temporary graves marked by wooden posts, their names sometimes inscribed on tin tags nailed to trees. German bodies were often buried hastily by civilian laborers under Soviet supervision. In some cases, remains were left exposed for days before being recovered. The terrain made transportation difficult, and in late February, freezing temperatures preserved the dead even as their identities faded. Survivors among the local population, farmers, mill workers, and railway personnel, would later recount the lingering sounds of combat, the rumble of artillery, the shriek of Katyusha rockets, the long silences that followed. Oral histories collected in the 1970s include testimonies from children who had watched Soviet soldiers carry wounded comrades down from the hill, and from women who fed Red Army troops from cellars where their own food reserves had been hidden. These memories rarely distinguish between sides. For many, the bunker was not German or Soviet. It was simply the place where everything had burned. Strategically, the region was pacified within weeks. Soviet formations, once reorganized, resumed their offensive into Moravia and Austria. The 375th Rifle Division was rotated to a support role after sustaining losses during the siege, replaced by fresher units better equipped for open-terrain operations. The gap created by the Zolna delay was quickly closed through forced marches and armored redeployment. In operational terms, the cost was absorbed. In human terms, the consequences were more permanent. Within a month, the forest began to grow again. Ash mixed with snow, burying shell fragments, charred helmets, and the outlines of trench lines. By the spring of 1945, locals reclaimed the area for grazing and foraging, often collecting spent brass and damaged weapons to trade or repurpose. Children played on ruined gun emplacements. Soviet patrols occasionally returned, but the area no longer held strategic value. The bunker, buried and silent, had passed into disuse. The Red Army never commemorated the siege. No obelisk was raised, no medal issued specifically for the engagement. Yet in internal files, in engineering blueprints, and in the faded journals of officers and soldiers who survived it, the battle was acknowledged for what it had been: a tactical anomaly, a drain on strength, a flashpoint of adaptation. And as the war moved on, erasing old battlefields with new ones, the hill remained behind, mute witness to the moment when two exhausted armies collided over a fortified question neither had wanted to ask, but both were forced to answer. In the decades following the end of the Second World War, the events at the Zolna bunker slipped quietly into the margins of history, overshadowed by larger battles, grand offensives, and more politically charged moments of resistance or victory. The siege was never elevated to symbolic status. Yet within specialized military circles, academic studies, and classified archives, it endured. Studied not as a heroic tale or dramatic episode, but as a critical case in the calculus of late-war attrition, resistance, and adaptation. For the Soviet Union, the legacy of the engagement was institutional rather than cultural. Though never memorialized in public monuments or mainstream wartime narratives, the lessons from the Zolna operation were internalized in Cold War-era doctrine. In 1951, a restricted Red Army engineering manual, circulated only among senior staff and military academies, cited the engagement in anonymized form as Hill 217 Incident. The manual emphasized principles that had emerged directly from the siege: the vulnerability of mobile forces to static strong points in restrictive terrain, the need for deep penetration munitions in forested areas, and the importance of secondary escape routes in enemy fortification design. These principles would re-emerge in the 1960s as the Soviet Union began to prepare for potential conflicts in Eastern Europe's mountainous zones and underground NATO command bunkers. Military exercises in the Carpathians simulated attacks on Z-type targets, often modeled on topographic data extracted from the original Zolna site, Officers drilled in bunker clearance not just with conventional weapons, but with seismic sensors, high-temperature thermobaric devices, and gas dispersal systems, tools forged from the realization that brute force alone had failed to neutralize the Zollner structure in a timely manner. In West Germany, the site found muted echoes in Bundeswehr defense planning. Although politically sensitive due to its SS associations, Zollner was studied by post-war military engineers for its structural survivability and resourceful use of terrain. In the 1970s, NATO training exercises in southern Bavaria incorporated scenarios titled Fortress in the Trees and Breakout from Hill Station, both drawn loosely from declassified battlefield analyses. These scenarios emphasized communications denial, countermining operations, and psychological pressure, tactics which had evolved directly from observing the Soviet struggles at Zollner. In Slovakia, however, the bunker was neither glorified nor fully erased. For decades, its precise location remained unofficially known among local villagers and amateur historians. Shepherds would warn children away from certain depressions in the forest floor, where rusted barbed wire still coiled among the roots. Occasionally, in dry seasons, war-era debris, an ammunition belt, a crushed canteen, a section of field cable would surface in the soft earth. Yet there was no plaque, no official archaeological effort, and little public discourse about what had happened in February 1945. That silence was not accidental. Under the post-war Czechoslovak regime, Soviet victories were to be celebrated in set ways, and engagements that reflected tactical missteps or disproportionate casualties, especially against remnants of the Waffen SS, were omitted or reframed. The complexity of Zollner's narrative, which included a disciplined German breakout, significant Soviet losses, and ambiguous civilian experiences, did not lend itself easily to myth-making. As such, it remained classified, unspoken, and largely forgotten. Only in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of restricted archives, did fragments of the engagement begin to surface in scholarly literature. A handful of post-Cold War military historians began publishing comparative studies of fortified resistance on the Eastern Front. Zollner appeared in footnotes, diagrams, and technical appendices, its details reconstructed from Soviet after-action reports, German engineering logs, and oral histories preserved by local populations. These studies reframed the siege not as an isolated anomaly, but as an early precursor to a style of warfare that would return in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Chechnya. Battles fought not over cities or supply lines, but over hardened shelters hidden in terrain. This analytical framing influenced military training worldwide. By the early 2000s, NATO field manuals included references to adaptive siege environments, drawing examples from Zollner, among others. Instructors at military academies use the siege to illustrate the psychological toll of static resistance, the importance of logistics in prolonged forest operations, and the complexities of interpreting enemy behavior under encirclement. The site itself, still buried and largely inaccessible, became a kind of silent reference point, a location cited in slideshows, not in ceremonies. Among civilian researchers, the legacy took a different form. Oral history projects launched in northern Slovakia during the 2010s collected testimony from families who had lived near the site. Their stories, previously suppressed or fragmented, spoke of fear, confusion, hunger, and silence. One farmer recalled how Soviet soldiers, mistaking his barn for an outpost, burned it down with his livestock inside. Another recounted how her mother gave water to wounded Red Army men in secret, afraid of being denounced by both sides. These testimonies added a human layer to the archive, a reminder that while military thinkers focused on concrete and tactics, people lived through those 48 hours in terrified proximity. Efforts to formally preserve the site have remained limited, though some local historians have advocated for excavation or partial reconstruction. Environmental concerns and a lack of funding have forestalled any action. The forest, now part of a protected regional park, covers the remains. In satellite imagery, faint traces of the outer trench lines are still visible during winter months, when snow highlights the depressions. But to the casual observer, the hill appears like any other, quiet, wooded, anonymous. Yet for those who know what lies beneath, the hill is not forgotten. Occasionally, small groups of military students, researchers, or history enthusiasts hike into the area. Some bring declassified maps and try to trace the outline of the bunker. Others place small stones or tags near known entrance points. No formal memorial exists, but a kind of informal remembrance endures, a silent acknowledgement that something significant happened here, out of view, nearly erased. In the end, the Zolna bunker became not a symbol of victory or defeat, but of endurance. It stood not because of ideology or orders, but because a group of soldiers, cut off and undersupplied, followed procedures, held their ground, and tried to survive. It fell not to brute force, but to time, exhaustion, and the inevitability of war's forward motion. Its story remains buried, just beneath the soil, beneath the official histories, beneath the myths of glory. Yet it continues to shape how wars are studied, how resistance is measured, and how silence itself can become a monument.